Hello, this is a supplemental podcast for the legal ethics module. It's touching on some issues that have been discussed recently. I've seen in newspapers and on television debate programs, as well as witnessing debates between people on social media around this issue. And it's brought out some issues that are relevant to things that we discuss in legal ethics. So it's worth focusing on here. The topic that's been that I've seen in the news lately at any rate, has been around moves to make smacking children illegal in Scotland, bringing it in line with other countries, likewise in Wales as well. So in line with countries like Sweden, where smacking children has been illegal since 1979. That debate around whether smacking is right or wrong is not what I'm intending to get into here, because for one thing it's unbelievably boring, but also because it's not really what the legal matter I want to explore isn't whether or not smacking a 10-year-old is good parenting or bad parenting or whatever you might think it is. What interests me is that in the discussions I've seen in the papers and the TV programs and social media and so forth, nobody has talked about what happens to parents who do smack their kids, their 5, 6, 7, 8, whatever age they might be, children, and are reported to the police. Now, clearly as and when this becomes a formal, there's going to be loads of people who do smack their children and no one ever reports them, so it never gets to the court case in the first place. But what happens if the child, a neighbour, a relative, a passing stranger in the street, whoever it might be, reports that parent? In fact, not only have I not seen people talking about the consequences to the parent, in concrete terms, are we talking a prison sentence? Are we talking a fine? Are we talking so many hours of community service? What are we talking about in terms of what happens to a parent convicted of smacking their child? And I'm not talking beating, obviously, because there are already laws in place. We've got Section 58 of the Children's Act going back to 2004, which replaced much earlier laws, which were designed to outlaw parents knocking 7 shades out of their kids and hospitalising them and doing horrifically violent things. That's been illegal for quite a few decades now in this country. This is a smack we're talking about, rather than bashing 7 shades out of a child. So what happens to the parent if they are reported to the police? I have seen people, including solicitors, legal professionals, saying that this proposed law, both proposed in this country but also as it is utilised in other countries in Europe and other parts of the world, is not intended to criminalise parents. And that's the part that is interesting from a legal ethics point of view. Not the does smacking work, does it not argument, but the suggestion here is that the law should be utilised. Politicians should be persuaded to pass laws in Parliament, which are then on the statute books, laws which could be enforced by police, can result in court cases, can result in convictions, but which the people campaigning for these changes of law, and in some countries already have succeeded in getting those changes in law, don't want that law enforced. The argument that seems to be presented by various different voices that I've encountered, none of them ethical theorists, just solicitors and what have you being interviewed on TV and newspapers. So their argument seems to be that the law should be setting a moral example. So there are lots of sort of individual parents and people involved in campaigning and pressure groups and child welfare organisations and what have you, who are rallying around to say, we want the government to make a stand to say smacking is wrong, and we think they should pass a law to indicate that they think smacking is wrong, that parents should use non-physical forms of disciplining, chastising their children. But but we don't actually want them to send parents to prison or impose fines upon them or what have you for smacking their children. And that is a curiosity, because generally speaking, the answer to the question of what is criminal law for, it is to punish people who do things that are considered illegal. Potentially morally wrong, but certainly illegal. Some of the arguments we look at around the American legal theorist Lon Fuller, who argued quite a few decades back now that there are two spheres, like a Venn diagram. One of these spheres is morality, the customs and morals of a given culture or society, and the other sphere is legality. And sometimes these spheres overlap a little bit, and sometimes they don't. There are large spheres that don't overlap. So his argument being that there are things which a society might consider morally inappropriate or undesirable or morally dubious in some way, but that are never made into law. So you could say that being horribly rude to your parents or to your husband or wife or whoever is not a morally desirable thing, being vicious and nasty and poisonous. But we don't generally, well, in this country certainly, we do not pass laws saying someone should be arrested and hauled into court for saying rude, nasty things to their mother, their granny, their father, their husband, wife, whoever. We may morally disapprove of it and tut at people in the street in a very British way, look at them sternly when we see them doing it, but we don't expect the police to turn up, thwack them with a truncheon and haul them away for a court case. Equally, there are other things that fall in the sphere of law, which are behaviours that have been banned, regulated, controlled, and so forth, which we wouldn't necessarily consider as having a moral dimension. All sorts of fairly minor traffic-related infringements, people parking in inappropriate places. Well, I suppose if they've parked in an ambulance bay at a hospital and prevented patients being treated, we might consider that perhaps immoral. But generally speaking, there's lots of fairly trivial laws, petty bureaucratic laws around paying your taxes and that sort of thing, where we wouldn't particularly condemn an individual for breaking those laws. In fact, in some cases, possibly we might even approve of it. But it's illegal, but not with any real moral context to it. Then, as Lon Fuller said, there is that overlap, things like murder, rape, torture, breaking into people's houses, where the vast majority of the public would agree that it is both immoral and illegal at the same time. Now, does smacking a child fall into the category of being legally undesirable, but not particularly moral? Does it fall into the category of being perhaps morally undesirable, but not the business of law to interfere with? Or does it fall into that middle zone of being both illegal and immoral? The proposition is to move, and at the moment we can argue it is not illegal. Some people may disapprove of it, some people obviously do approve of it and think it's a good way to parent, but others don't. So for some people it is a moral issue, but not yet a legal issue. But there is a campaign to make it a legal issue. But again, this begs the question of what the law is for. If the law is to control undesirable behaviours, with or without the moral context, then those undesirable behaviours are controlled by a system of punishments. That may be a prison sentence, it may be a fine, it may be community service. Some parts of the world, and certainly historically in this country, it would have included the death sentence, and obviously other parts of the world we might have flogging or amputation of limbs or all sorts of things that go on around the world, where a judicial system says, if we catch you doing this and a jury convicts you, this is the horrible thing that will happen to you as a consequence, in the hope that, well, it will either prevent the person doing it again, certainly if you've hanged them or shot them, they definitely won't do that again, or it will, at least if it's not a terminal response, it will discourage the individual, and there is a deterrent effect perhaps for other people contemplating that crime who might think, oh, well, I know so-and-so who was caught and they went to prison for 5 years or what have you. I won't commit that crime because I'm worried I'll get caught and the same thing will happen to me. So it has all of those sorts of effects, and we can, of course, as we do later on in the course, talk about rehabilitation and issues, how prisons can help people rehabilitate and so forth. But those are hardline consequences for individuals of an unpleasant nature. Courts don't sentence people to an afternoon of tea and cake. They sentence them to something that is assumed to be unpleasant for the individual as a punishment. That's the nature of what the law is about. Therefore, if you have a law that nobody wants to enforce, it's just there so that government can tut at people and say, don't do that, it's not very appropriate, look, we made a law about it, but we're not going to enforce it. It's just there. Is that an appropriate use of law? And that's where the ethical question, the legal ethical question comes in. What is an appropriate use of law? What do we want the law, we as citizens, voters, so forth, what do we want the law to be about? Do we want it to be about taking a moral stance, but without any notion that that moral stance should be enforced through trials, through police investigations, through some form of judicial punishment or another for the convicted criminal? Because if we don't want that, then do we really want the law to be involved? We might want government to disapprove of something. We might want the Prime Minister to issue a statement, because clearly lots of people pay attention to that, saying that something is wrong or undesirable or unsuitable or whatever language you want to use. But that is different. Getting the executive branch of government involved in tutting about things, if you like, is not necessarily the same as getting the legislature involved in creating laws or getting the judiciary involved in implementing those laws in court cases. There is an argument to be made around legal paternalism. Paternalism, as you'll know from previous years, is the idea of somebody coming along and effectively saying daddy knows best or mummy knows best, as the case may be. You could just as easily call it maternalism as paternalism. Effectively saying that this behaviour is inappropriate and you're doing something, but we don't think you should be doing it, so we're going to intervene to stop you from doing it, even if you want to do it. That includes things with no traditional victim, shall we say, if we can put it like that. So drug use, people who choose to become prostitutes, people who choose to engage in various activities that other people might find alarming or disturbing, or immoral or inappropriate or what have you. So that the law can come in and say, yes, you may be voluntarily doing this thing, you may be voluntarily choosing to smoke cannabis or go on the game or do whatever, but we, the law, feel that we know better, that you shouldn't be doing this and it's not good for you. So we're going to intervene and we're going to tell you it's wrong and if necessary take you to court and if necessary implement some sort of punishment to make you conscious of how wrong it is. And of course these days, certainly when it comes to drug abuse, a number of courts will implement rehabilitation orders, so that part of the deal at the end of the court case is that individual has to go into some kind of therapy and so forth to get over their drug use and so on. Is that what is being proposed here? Do we want, or I'll say the people who are campaigning for these changes, do they want parents to be sentenced not to prison but to some kind of re-education, that they're packed off to somewhere where they will be taught how to parent their offspring without slapping them? I suspect that may be ultimately where this would go to, because if you don't want to put them in prison, and it would be awfully bizarre if you're effectively asking some 8-year-old to give evidence that mummy or daddy slapped them and then mummy or daddy goes down for 6 months, it's hardly helping the family dynamic any. That's not going to have a particularly positive effect on the family. Likewise, if you're fining the parent a large sum of money, then that money that fine is effectively money that will not then be spent upon the child. So it's not necessarily in the overall interests of the child. If they're not at risk of life and limb, obviously a wholly different situation. If you've got a viciously violent parent who's beating their child black and blue, but if we're talking a slap, then I don't think many of the campaigners pushing for this would want to see a kind of punishment that would disrupt the family. But they're clearly wanting this disapproval expressed, that the law should be there for a bit of moral tutting, a bit of paternalistic, you shouldn't do that. Re-education seems a likely way to go. Well, to me it smacks a little bit of that kind of Stalinist packing people off to outer Siberia to learn how to think the way government believes they should think. I know that's a rather extreme example to say for sort of slapping kids, but re-education to make people change their ways has this little aura of how far is this re-education going to go? You start re-educating people on one thing. How much longer before you're re-educating them on all sorts of other things? But compulsory parenting classes, is that what is being called for? Is it the job of law to step in and implement education? It kind of is happening already. I've mentioned the drug conviction example of saying to people, well, part of the order of this court is that you have to learn to overcome your drug habit, and we're going to send you to be with therapists and so forth who will help you. It happens with driving offences, speeding offences. People are sent on these courses to make them learn to be better drivers and that sort of a thing. So there is already an extent to which the court is not dispensing fines or prison sentences or hanging, shooting and flogging, but it is dispensing education and to some extent therapy with drug users. Almost as if that was part and parcel of punishment. And I suppose for some people it must sometimes feel as if they're made to sit in a room and listen to things they don't really want to listen to, so maybe there is an element of punitiveness there as well, for some people at least. But it's a curious change in that courts have gone from dispensing punishments to now dispensing education. And whereas it may start with things like the driver courses for speeding drivers and drug rehab for people with drug and alcohol issues, are we now looking at the courts taking on more and more of a remit as various different pressure groups saying, well, we don't approve of parents smacking their children, we don't approve of this, we don't approve of that, and creating a kind of a precedence for groups to get involved to say, we want something outlawed, but we don't actually want anyone sent to prison, we don't actually want them fined, we don't actually want them treated as traditional criminals, we want the court to wag its finger at them and send them on a course, make them do this, make them do that, and somehow teach them to be better people. Is that the new function of law, or one of, at any rate, the new functions of law? Historically, it has not been a function of law. And obviously, the law is not fixed in amber. It doesn't kind of have X many functions and it's never allowed to do anything else. But this is introducing a new concept where we're starting to think of the law in a different role. So expanding its remit, taking on other functions. It's an interesting curiosity. We've touched a little bit on ideas around paternalism in the course, and we will come back to these sorts of issues of paternalism as well, in the sense of the law being used to reprimand people in a gentle sort of, I say, not in terms of full-on prison sentences and so forth, but to wag a finger and say this is inappropriate, we have got to interfere in your behaviour. One of the things we'll look at in more depth, and I'll make a separate podcast around that at some point in the future, is the extent to which the courts are intervening, perhaps would be a better word on this one, not just with maliciously criminal behaviour, murder and rape and mugging old ladies and the rest of it, but also with behaviour that could be better termed irrational. It's certainly an idea that Dawkins talks about, that when it comes to paternalism, Dawkins argues there is a limited role for paternalist intervention laws where the person being affected, I hesitate to call them criminal, but the target of legal activity is doing whatever it is that they're doing, not because they are some malicious law-breaking individual, but because they are seen to be less than rational in their decision-making. So the law becomes involved, I'll come back to the drug addiction arguments. If somebody wants to sit there and snort a line of coke, they are not forcing the coke on anyone else. No one is forcing the coke on them. There comes the things that traditionally define crime: the violation of will, breaking into somebody's house against their will, bashing them over the head with a brick against their will. Those are more, shall we say, traditional styles of crime where there is a clear violation of will. But drug use, a prostitute selling sex to a customer, both of whom are willing to take part in the activity, there are some legal areas where no one's will is being violated. And the argument being that the individual who is snorting the line of coke or selling their sexual services is engaging in an activity they are not to engage in that activity, they must not be in the right state of mind. Therefore, the law has got this paternalist parental role to come along and say, look, much as you might to a naughty 10-year-old, you may want to stick your fingers in a plug socket, but I'm not going to let you stick your fingers in a plug socket because I know what will happen to you when you do. It is dangerous. It's my job as your mother, father, to save you from your own silliness, to prevent harm happening to you, even if you are freely choosing to do the thing that's going to harm you. So the law comes along and says, yes, you might want to snort cocaine, but we know what's going to happen to you if you do, and we are going to prevent you, because, or essentially implying that to want to do this in the first place, you've got to be a little bit irrational and need looking after. You are then in the position of a silly 10-year-old who is doing something that someone who is older and wiser wouldn't do because they would know better. And there is an element of intervention on that one. The reason I'm mentioning it here, so we'll go over that in more depth in a separate podcast as well as talking about it in class, but the reason I'm mentioning here is that there is almost, I think, an element of that at play in these debates around parents smacking children, inappropriate, unsuitable forms of parenting. To suggest almost that this is not necessarily someone who is a malicious monster who's kicking their child up and down stairs. This rather is someone who is short-tempered and smacked the child in a state, they're having a really bad day, or they've got all sorts of pressures, and that they've snapped and they've used an inappropriate form of, or what some people consider an inappropriate form of punishment, as if they are irrational, and somebody needs to come along, take the parent, plonk them in a corner and say, look, you may have been using this style of parenting, but we know it's not appropriate, and you only did it because you didn't know any better, so we are going to teach you better. We are going to show you it's inappropriate, and either maybe at some point it will be a court-ordered parenting course, or maybe we'll just wag our finger and assume somehow that will be enough to make parents who slap their kids stop slapping their kids because we've wagged a finger at them. But we will discourage you in some way, because that sense that if you knew better, you wouldn't be doing this. So it's not malice, it's not knowing better, it's being possibly irrational isn't the best word to use in this context, but that's what Dawkins talks about, this sense of the person really not quite knowing well enough, or they're not quite with it. Dawkins expands the idea to reflect on other things, like the role of mental illness in court cases where someone is deemed legally not responsible for their actions. So there's a lot more to it than the little bit I'm touching on here. But there's a few ideas to think about and get discussion going in class. I think I'll leave it there, but it'll be interesting to see what you think. Thank you.